It was a cold, rainy evening in downtown Seattle, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel a little heavier. The city was bustling, as usual, people darting between awnings and coffee shops, avoiding puddles and chasing time. Among the crowd was a figure no one expected to see walking unnoticed: Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft, philanthropist, and one of the richest men in the world. Dressed in a simple grey raincoat, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low, he blended in effortlessly. Gates had always preferred subtlety, especially when he wanted to think. That evening, he wasn't on his way to a meeting or a speaking event. He had just left a quiet dinner with an old college friend, someone he hadn't seen in years. Their conversation had stirred something in him, reflections on the past, on legacy, on purpose. As he walked along 3rd Avenue, lost in thought, his eyes caught something, or rather, someone, that pulled him out of his mental haze. Near the corner of an alley, half sheltered by a dilapidated awning, sat a woman wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing. Her hands were cupped around a steaming paper cup of coffee, likely donated by a kind passerby. She had a small American flag patch sewn onto her tattered backpack, along with a few military pins. Her posture was proud, yet weary, and her eyes, tired but clear, watched the world with a calm defiance. Bill paused. He had seen countless homeless individuals in his life, especially in major cities. He had donated millions to combat homelessness. But something about her made him stop. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. He said gently, "Would you mind if I sat for a moment?" She looked up, surprised not just by the stranger's words, but by the tone. She nodded slightly. Gates sat down on the cold sidewalk beside her. They talked for nearly an hour. Her name was Lisa. She had served in the U.S. Army for 12 years, deployed multiple times, and had been honorably discharged. Life had taken a dark turn after her return: medical bills, a lack of support systems, PTSD, and an eventual eviction. She had been living on the streets for over 2 years now. Gates listened more than he spoke. He asked questions, not out of pity, but from genuine interest. Lisa's intelligence was evident. Her sense of humor had sharp edges. Her reflections on society, war, and human nature were more profound than many TED Talks he'd attended. When he finally stood up, he didn't offer her money. Instead, he handed her a small card. "This is my assistant's contact info. No pressure. But if you ever feel like changing your situation, I think we can help." Lisa didn't call the next day. Or the next week. It was nearly a month before she walked into a modest office building in Bellevue, card in hand. She asked for Melinda. The receptionist made a call. 10 minutes later, Bill Gates walked into the lobby himself. He didn't just help her off the streets. He offered her something much rarer: a real second chance. With therapy support, housing, and time, Lisa began to heal. But what amazed everyone was what happened next. Lisa didn't want to simply be helped. She wanted to help others. She proposed an idea to Gates, a foundation aimed specifically at homeless veterans, particularly women, who were often overlooked. Gates agreed to fund it, on one condition: Lisa would run it. The foundation launched quietly but grew rapidly. Lisa, with her fierce empathy and unshakable resolve, became a national voice. Interviews, articles, and speaking engagements followed. She testified before Congress. She visited VA hospitals and shelters. She even declined a personal salary, choosing instead to live modestly and direct every dollar toward outreach and support. Years later, a documentary crew followed Lisa for a feature film. When asked about that rainy night in Seattle, she smiled. "He didn't save me," she said. "He saw me. And sometimes, that's all it takes." Bill Gates never spoke much publicly about Lisa. He didn't need to. But in a quiet corner of the Gates Foundation headquarters, there's a photo of the two of them, sitting on that sidewalk. Side by side, sharing a moment that would change countless lives. And that's the story the world never saw coming, not just of generosity, but of recognition. Not of charity, but of belief. A story not about what Bill Gates gave, but what he saw, a human being worthy of a second chance. And what she did with it. That's what truly blew everyone's mind. But Lisa's journey didn't end there. Her foundation, Second Watch, expanded to 10 cities across the United States within 5 years. It partnered with universities to provide scholarships to homeless veterans, created peer-to-peer counseling networks, and even influenced national policy. She spearheaded a campaign called Uniform to Unseen, which brought thousands of homeless veteran stories into the public consciousness. One winter, she returned to that same street corner in Seattle, not in rags, but in a navy peacoat, speaking to a group of volunteers handing out blankets and food. She paused and looked up at the awning that had once sheltered her. A moment of silence passed. Then she smiled. She never forgot where she came from, and she made sure no one else would be forgotten either. Bill Gates, in one of his rare mentions of Lisa at a private philanthropy summit, said this: "Some people invest in stocks, others in ideas. I invested in a person. It was the best return I've ever gotten." And so, her story continues, echoed in every veteran who finds hope through her work, in every speech she gives to inspire others, and in every silent thank you whispered by someone she'll never meet but who was touched by her mission. A rainy night, a quiet conversation, and an unseen woman with the heart of a warrior, that's how legacies begin. Lisa would go on to receive several humanitarian awards, including a Presidential Medal of Freedom. But to her, the real victory was not the recognition. It was the quiet success stories that poured into her inbox, veterans who had reunited with their families, women who had started their own advocacy groups, and those who had simply found peace. Her days were long, filled with meetings, travel, and emotional moments, but she carried herself with the same quiet strength Gates had seen that night. And when people asked her how she managed to stay grounded through it all, she would always tell them the same thing. "I remember who I was when no one else did. That's my compass." Years later, when Bill Gates retired from public life, one of his last public letters didn't speak of technology or wealth. It spoke of Lisa. Of that night. Of the power of truly seeing someone. And as for Lisa, she kept going. A light on dark streets, a hand on the shoulder of the forgotten, a name whispered in reverence by those who had once given up. Because some stories don't end. They ripple, like rain falling endlessly on a city that once looked away, and finally learned to see. Eventually, Lisa passed the leadership of Second Watch to a fellow veteran she had mentored. But she didn't step away completely. Instead, she turned her focus to international advocacy, launching programs for displaced women veterans around the globe. From refugee camps in Eastern Europe to remote villages in Southeast Asia, Lisa brought the same message: dignity, recognition, and hope. Her story began with a cold sidewalk and a stranger who chose to sit and listen. But it became a worldwide movement, a legacy built not on wealth or fame, but on compassion, resilience, and the simple act of truly seeing another human being. And even decades later, when her name is mentioned, people don't think of her as someone who was once homeless, they remember her as someone who changed the world. All because, one rainy night in Seattle, Bill Gates stopped to say, "May I sit with you?" When Lisa finally retired from public service, she moved to a quiet coastal town in Oregon. There, she lived in a small cottage overlooking the sea, peaceful, modest, and filled with books, photographs, and handwritten letters from people all around the world. She taught at a local community college, sharing her story not as a lecture, but as a dialogue. Students didn't see her as a celebrity, they saw her as a guide. In her final years, she published a memoir titled Seen, which became a bestseller not because of fame, but because of truth. In it, she wrote, "Being seen saved my life. Seeing others changed it." The memoir was translated into dozens of languages, becoming a staple in libraries, schools, and shelters across the globe. It became a symbol of possibility, a reminder that even from the darkest corners, light can emerge. And on the day of her passing, tributes flowed from every corner of the earth. Heads of state, veterans, social workers, and students alike remembered Lisa not for where she started, but for where she helped others go. A statue was later placed at that same Seattle street corner. It didn't depict wealth or power. It showed two people sitting side by side on a rainy sidewalk, talking. And on its base, a simple inscription: "Every life has value. Every moment matters. Every person deserves to be seen." That statue became more than just a memorial, it became a gathering place. People from all walks of life would come there to sit, reflect, and sometimes even speak to strangers. School field trips included it in their itineraries, and visitors left flowers, military patches, letters, and sometimes just a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for seeing me." The city of Seattle, once overwhelmed by the challenges of homelessness, began to transform, not overnight, not through politics alone, but through a cultural shift sparked by Lisa's work. Her foundation's outreach model was studied and replicated in over 30 countries. Universities introduced curricula based on her strategies of trauma-informed care, peer mentoring, and systemic reintegration. But it wasn't just about policy or charity, it was about humanity. Lisa's story began to appear in unexpected places: a university ethics textbook in Germany, a mural in a New York subway station, a case study in a Japanese leadership course, even a verse in a poem recited at a United Nations gathering. Her message had transcended borders, language, and politics. In one especially moving event, a group of formerly homeless veterans who had found housing and purpose through Second Watch marched together in the Veterans Day Parade in Washington, D.C. They wore matching jackets with a single word embroidered across the back: "Seen." Lisa wasn't at the front of the parade, she never wanted to be. She stood in the crowd, clapping, tears in her eyes, camera in hand, just another face among the thousands who believed in a better world because of what she had once endured and overcome. One of those marching veterans, Carmen, a single mother who had escaped an abusive home before joining the military, later said, "Lisa didn't just give me a place to sleep. She gave me back my voice." And once you've been heard, you never forget how to speak up for others. Lisa's legacy even impacted the tech world. Inspired by her work, Bill Gates pushed for tech-funded initiatives that used AI and data analytics to track veteran homelessness in real time, streamlining access to shelters, medical care, and jobs. Through this, thousands more lives were touched, not through a single heroic act, but through systems that listen better because one person once truly listened. The foundation eventually established the Lisa Monroe Leadership Institute, dedicated to training the next generation of community organizers, social workers, and policymakers. Applicants from over 60 countries applied to the first cohort. Among them were veterans, refugees, young activists, and former foster children, all united by a desire to see and serve those like them. In her later years, Lisa became something of a myth, a quiet legend. She declined most interviews, preferring small gatherings, workshops, and one-on-one conversations. She said public attention was fleeting, but human connection lasted. Occasionally, people would spot her at airports or cafes and hesitate to approach. But if they did, she always had time for them. She never turned down a conversation because she remembered exactly what it felt like to be invisible. A young woman once stopped her in Portland and said, "I don't know what to say. You changed my life." Lisa just smiled and said, "Then go change someone else's." After her passing, her will contained a simple directive that no buildings be named after her. Instead, she asked that her memorial fund be used to create mobile mental health units for female veterans in rural areas. The project was launched within a year. It was called ECHO, in honor of the idea that compassion, once given, reverberates endlessly. Bill Gates, who had already stepped back from most public roles, flew in quietly to attend her private funeral. He didn't speak. But he left something behind, a single folded note placed atop her casket. No one opened it. No one needed to. Because those who knew the story, who had been part of that journey from rain-soaked pavement to global impact, already understood what it must have said. And so, long after the headlines faded and awards were boxed away, Lisa's real impact continued, whispered in the hallways of shelters, taught in classrooms, repeated in prayers by people she'd never met. A young boy in Detroit once wrote a school essay titled My Hero, and it ended like this. Some people become famous. Some people change the world. Lisa did both, and she never asked for either. The story of Lisa and Bill Gates didn't begin with a plan or a grand gesture. It began with a pause. A moment of eye contact. A willingness to sit down on cold concrete and simply listen. And it lives on, in every act of kindness done without a camera, in every voice lifted for the forgotten, in every corner where someone chooses to see. Because that night in Seattle wasn't just a turning point for one woman. It was a spark. And sparks, when passed with care, can light entire worlds. Years passed, and yet the ripple from that single moment in Seattle continued to widen, quietly shaping lives far beyond what anyone had imagined. In a small town in West Virginia, a middle school teacher named Danielle used Lisa's memoirs Singe as part of her 8th grade curriculum. Her students, many from families struggling with poverty or addiction, connected deeply with Lisa's story. It wasn't the fame or the foundation that moved them, it was the raw honesty of someone who had fallen, had been overlooked, and had fought her way back not through anger, but through grace and service. One student, Elijah, wrote in his reflection journal, "If she can come from nothing and still give everything, then maybe I can too." Years later, Elijah would become a social worker, returning to his hometown to build a youth center in the very school where he'd first read her words. Lisa's influence also reached the halls of medicine. A veteran named Dr. Marcus Lynn, who had once been on the verge of homelessness himself, cited Lisa as the reason he pushed through medical school. He pioneered trauma-informed care practices specifically for military women, emphasizing empathy and dignity. His clinic bore no plaques or marble walls, just a quote painted above the front desk. "You were never invisible here." Meanwhile, the Second Watch Foundation continued to expand globally. In Cape Town, South Africa, it partnered with local veterans to create safe housing for women who had served during regional conflicts. In Norway, it helped fund winter-proof shelters for displaced veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. In Japan, Lisa's model inspired the Silent Voice initiative, which brought together retired servicewomen to form support collectives, combining traditional cultural values with modern mental health practices. Lisa had never intended to become a global figure. She often said she was just trying to build a longer table instead of a higher fence. But the world, hungry for authenticity and leadership rooted in humility, elevated her, not because of her fame, but because of her unwavering humanity. On the 10th anniversary of that rainy night in Seattle, a commemorative event was held at the Gates Foundation. The guest list was unusual, not CEOs or celebrities, but people who had been touched directly by Lisa's work. Formerly homeless mothers, young veterans, caseworkers, students, and teachers. They stood on the stage one by one and told stories. Not about Lisa, but about themselves, who they had become because someone believed in them. At the end of the evening, a young girl, no older than 10, stepped to the microphone. Her name was Riley, and she had never met Lisa. But her father had, back when he was a broken man sleeping in his car, too ashamed to call home. "Miss Lisa helped my dad," Riley said, voice trembling. "She didn't give him money. She gave him hope. And now he helps other dads too. She made our family whole." The room fell silent, and not a single dry eye remained. Outside, it rained, a soft, persistent drizzle like the one that had started it all. A few attendees quietly walked to the statue and stood before it. Some knelt. Some touched the cold bronze shoulder of the sitting figure. Some whispered thanks. And still, new stories were beginning. In a university library in Cairo, a student named Omal translated Seen into Arabic, distributing copies to local shelters for refugee women. In Buenos Aires, a filmmaker began a project chronicling veterans' reintegration stories across Latin America, citing Lisa as her guiding inspiration. In Toronto, a coalition of indigenous veterans founded their own version of Second Watch, adapting its principles to meet the needs of First Nations communities. Even in the halls of policymaking, her philosophy took root. New bills passed in state legislatures carried echoes of her ideas that dignity should be policy, not charity. That those who had served, and those who had suffered, were not burdens to be managed, but voices to be heard. And what of Bill Gates? He continued his philanthropic work, quieter now, more reflective. He once said in an interview, Helping Lisa didn't make me feel generous. It made me feel responsible. There's a difference. After her passing, he carried a small laminated card in his wallet. Not a credit card. Not an ID. Just a copy of the note she left him once, in the early days of the Foundation's rise. It read, "Thank you for sitting down. Not above me. Not in front of me. But with me." That changed everything. Gates never showed it to anyone. But when asked, years later, what his greatest investment had ever been, he replied without hesitation. A moment of time on a cold sidewalk. That moment gave the world Lisa. And so the legend remained, not carved into mountains or recited in textbooks alone, but passed from person to person, in quiet conversations, in shelters, schools, coffee shops, and city council meetings. People remembered her not because she had power, but because she used compassion like a torch, lighting the way for others to walk their own paths, with their heads held high. If you ever find yourself in Seattle, on a quiet rainy evening, walk to the corner of 3rd Avenue. You'll see the statue, 2 people sitting side by side. One in a coat, one in a hoodie. No names. Just a story waiting to be told again. Sit there. Feel the rain. Watch the city. And listen. Because every once in a while, a story finds you. Not to be watched. Not to be told. But to be lived, one quiet act at a time. In the months after the 10-year commemoration, something unexpected began to happen. Letters started pouring into the Second Watch headquarters from across the globe. Not emails. Not tweets. Handwritten letters. Veterans from conflict zones, widows of soldiers, children who had grown up in shelters, and strangers who had never seen a battlefield but felt invisible in their own lives, they all wrote. They wrote about loneliness, about healing, about resilience. They wrote not to ask for help, but to say thank you. To say that Lisa had made them feel seen, even if she never knew their name. The letters came from cities and villages, from prisons and universities, from nursing homes and foster care centers. Second Watch turned one of its rooms into a reading library, not of books, but of these letters. On any given day, volunteers or visitors could walk in, pick up a page at random, and find themselves transported into a life touched by one woman's courage to rise and lift others with her. And then there was Michael. Michael Thompson was a Marine Corps veteran who had returned from deployment shattered by the weight of what he'd seen, and what he couldn't unsee. He'd lost his job, his marriage, his sense of identity. One night, on the verge of taking his own life, he found himself at a bus station with a tattered backpack and nowhere to go. There, taped to a light pole, was a weathered flyer, Second Watch shelter, come as you are. Michael took the bus. At the shelter, he was greeted not with questions or judgment, but with silence, warmth, and a hot meal. On his bunk lay a book, seen, with a handwritten note tucked inside the cover, "You are not broken. You are becoming." He stayed for weeks, then months. He went through therapy. He wrote poetry. He cried. He forgave. And then one morning, during group counseling, he said, if she could lead, why not me? Michael would go on to become the director of outreach for Second Watch's West Coast Division. Under his guidance, they launched a mobile support unit called the Watchtower, vans that travel to remote communities offering food, crisis care, and mental health check-ins for veterans and their families. One of the Watchtower units arrived at a remote outpost in New Mexico one summer, where a Navajo woman named Raina had been caring for her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran suffering from severe dementia and paranoia. She had tried everything: hospitals, clinics, traditional medicine, but support was non-existent. The Watchtower team stayed for 2 days. They helped Raina navigate the VA system, brought in culturally competent counselors, and even coordinated with tribal elders to blend traditional healing with modern care. Her grandfather, for the first time in years, slept through the night peacefully. Raina would later join the Foundation's leadership, forming its first Indigenous Advocacy Council. Her mantra was simple: healing must speak the language of the soul. Meanwhile, back in Oregon, Lisa's coastal home had become something of a pilgrimage site. Not for tourists, but for those who needed quiet. The local college, in partnership with the Gates Foundation, converted the cottage into a retreat and learning center called The Hearth. Only a few people were allowed to visit at a time. No cell phones. No cameras. Just notebooks, silence, and the sea. Students from across disciplines, social work, literature, public health, theology, came to the Hearth not to study Lisa's life, but to reflect on their own. To ask, what does it mean to serve? What does it mean to see? Among them was Amina, a medical student from Kenya. She'd grown up hearing her father speak about a woman named Lisa who had once helped his friend through a dark time during their service together. Amina's dream was to create mobile mental health units for displaced women in East Africa. After a month at the Hearth, she returned home and launched her pilot program, calling it Light on the Road. When asked why she named it that, she simply said, because that's what she was. A light on the road. Even in death, Lisa had sparked a quiet revolution. And still, the statue in Seattle remained untouched by politics or publicity. People came alone, in pairs, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears. Some left flowers. Others left dog tags. One child left a lunchbox with a note inside that read, "Thank you for saving my dad." Each year on the anniversary of her passing, no speeches were made. No big events. Just a small group gathering under the drizzle, sitting beside strangers, sharing stories, sometimes just sitting in silence, because that was enough. And what of the woman herself? How would she have viewed all of this? Those closest to her knew that Lisa never wanted to be a symbol. She wanted to be useful. In one of her final interviews, she was asked how she wanted to be remembered. She smiled, that quiet, knowing smile, and said, "As someone who didn't look away." That was all. But that was everything. Because in a world flooded with noise, with distraction and division, with outrage and apathy, Lisa had chosen presence. She had chosen to see, and in doing so, had reminded the world what mattered most. Not wealth. Not titles. But humanity. So next time you walk by someone on the street, a woman in a coat too thin for winter, a man muttering to himself, a child looking away, a stop. Even if just for a second. See them. Because you never know. That 1 second could be the moment that starts a ripple. Just like it did for Bill Gates on a rainy night in Seattle. As the years passed, the influence of Lisa's legacy began to show in places no one could have predicted. At Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a new course was introduced titled Leadership Through Service, the Lisa Model. It wasn't built on case studies of power or political maneuvering. Instead, it revolved around moments of vulnerability, the ethics of presence, and the long-term power of compassion-driven decision-making. One of the guest speakers that semester was Bill Gates. Now well into retirement, with silvered hair and slower steps, Gates walked into the auditorium carrying only a single item, a small, weathered paper coffee cup. The same kind Lisa had held on that first night they met. He didn't use slides. He didn't speak from notes. He simply told the students the story, in full, from the beginning. Not the version printed in articles or summarized in interviews, but the version with pauses, with doubt, with the awkwardness of real life. He described the moment he sat down beside a stranger and discovered a person with more insight than most boardrooms ever held. Then he said something that no one expected. In the business world, we measure success in numbers. In philanthropy, we measure it in reach. But Lisa taught me a new metric, depth. One life, seen deeply, can shift history. You're looking at the proof. He raised the cup slightly in his hand. This? It isn't a symbol. It's a reminder. That night, I saw a woman with nothing who gave me everything. And with that, he left the cup on the podium and walked away. Students didn't applaud. Many just sat in stillness, trying to absorb what they had heard. That cup remained in a glass case at the university from that day on. No plaque. No grand dedication. Just a single sentence etched into the wood below it. What you hold lightly might be the beginning of someone's everything. Meanwhile, the foundation continued to evolve. Lisa's protégé, Michael Thompson, launched a new initiative under the Second Watch umbrella called Vantage. It focused on giving veterans with lived experience a platform to advise public policy directly. Not lobbyists. Not bureaucrats. But people who had walked the walk. Within 3 years, Vantage helped pass 3 major bipartisan bills improving access to mental health services for female veterans, expanding transitional housing programs, and offering job training pathways that respected military experience. And beyond policy, stories continued to ripple. In Tokyo, a young tech entrepreneur named Emi Hiroshi, inspired by Lisa's memoir Scene, launched an AI-based system to detect loneliness in elderly care facilities. The system didn't just monitor vitals, it measured conversation patterns, eye contact, and social withdrawal. She called the algorithm Lisa, Life Identification Sentiment Algorithm, a tribute, she said, to the woman who taught the world to look again. In Johannesburg, a former child soldier who had escaped his militia and found asylum in the US launched a school named the Lisa House of Hope. Every classroom bore the name of a different city where Second Watch had operated. The school's motto, painted in bold red letters above the main entrance, read, "You are not where you came from. You are where you choose to stand." Lisa's image never adorned any building. Her statue in Seattle remained the only one. But that was how she wanted it. When she was once offered the opportunity to have a library named after her, she declined, saying, "Name it after someone who hasn't yet been seen. I've had my moment. Make sure someone else gets theirs." Back in Oregon, the Hearth grew into a seasonal fellowship, each year bringing in new waves of future social leaders. Writers, veterans, educators, and students would gather to study the art of presence, of listening, and of building things that mattered. One winter, a blizzard cut power to the facility for 2 days. Instead of canceling the retreat, the attendees huddled by firelight, reading from Lisa's writings, journaling, and sharing their own origin stories. The event would later be known as the Quiet Gathering, and became a tradition repeated every 5 years regardless of the weather. And somewhere, in a small apartment in Detroit, an older man named Charlie, who had once shared a shelter bunk with Lisa in her darkest days, kept a photo of her on his fridge. Each morning, before his shift as a janitor, he'd look at it and whisper, "We made it, Lise." Because he had made it, too. With help. With dignity. With hope. That's what most people misunderstood about Lisa's story. It wasn't just her transformation. It was what her belief ignited in others. A chain reaction of courage. An ecosystem of empathy. One person becomes a bridge. A bridge becomes a path. A path becomes a movement. And that movement? It keeps walking. Decades after that rainy night, children in schools across America would learn about Lisa not from history textbooks, but from illustrated storybooks. One particularly beloved title, The Lady with the Flag Backpack, became a bedtime favorite for thousands. Its final line was always read in a whisper by parents, as if passing down a secret of the universe. Everyone deserves to be seen, even you. And that, more than awards or memorials, was Lisa's final legacy. A world slightly more awake. As time moved forward, the impact of Lisa's life began to manifest not just in individuals or cities, but in systems, the very systems that had once failed her. By the early 2040s, a quiet revolution in veteran care was underway across the United States, and many attributed its foundation to one woman's story. Hospitals, shelters, and government programs began restructuring their protocols, placing lived experience at the center of training and decision-making. Veterans were no longer data points, they were mentors, leaders, advisors. A report by the Department of Veterans Affairs titled The Lisa Framework, Dignity-Centered Recovery became a guiding document for trauma-informed care practices. It emphasized something incredibly simple, but too often overlooked: listen first, act second. The foreword of the report opened with a quote from Lisa herself. "Don't give me a ladder if you're not going to stand beside it when I climb." Meanwhile, Second Watch expanded internationally. In Canada, New Zealand, and parts of Europe, chapters opened under local leadership, each adapting Lisa's values to their own cultural contexts. In Dublin, one such chapter, Qua Fisa, meaning well of knowledge in Irish, provided not only housing and therapy, but a unique storytelling program that trained former soldiers to become oral historians, preserving not just war records but emotional truth. One of Lisa's original visions had been to create a mobile outreach system, a literal fleet of vehicles retrofitted as traveling support centers. Each unit was nicknamed a watchtower, and they were painted deep navy blue with a simple white logo, two people sitting side by side on a bench. These watchtowers began to appear not only in urban hubs like Los Angeles and Chicago, but in forgotten rural corners, the kind of places where help often didn't reach. And everywhere these watchtowers went, they didn't just provide aid. They collected stories. Thousands of them. These narratives were compiled into a living archive called the Scene Library, a massive digital repository of human resilience, sorted not by name or conflict, but by emotion, grief, courage, rebirth, stillness, rage, peace. It became the largest empathy-based archive in the world. And at its digital entrance was a single line of code, a note Lisa had written in an early concept meeting before the archive even existed. If we are going to ask people to share their pain, we damn well better build them a place to put it. One story from that archive stood out. A young woman named Janelle, formerly homeless in Chicago and now a school counselor, wrote, "I slept under a broken billboard for 3 winters. The only thing keeping me warm was a copy of Scene I'd found in a community library bin. I read it so many times, the pages tore. I don't know if Lisa ever read my story. But if she did, I hope she knew this, she wasn't just seen. She helped me see myself again." In the final decade of her life, Lisa was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, not once, but 3 times. She never won. And she didn't care. When asked in a rare interview about the nominations, she simply smiled and said, "Peace isn't something you win. It's something you leave behind in others." At her 80th birthday celebration, which took place not in a banquet hall but in a converted barn in Oregon surrounded by students, veterans, and friends, a young boy nervously handed Lisa a letter. "I don't know if this is dumb," he said, "but I wrote you a poem." She knelt beside him. "Nothing that comes from truth is dumb," she said. He read, "Once I was a shadow, then I became a name. Then someone saw my fire, and the world was not the same. I walk because she saw me, not just where I'd been. And now I see the others, the way she saw within." Lisa cried that night. Not from sadness, but from knowing, deep in her bones, that her story had not ended, it had multiplied. Before her passing, she made one final request. She asked that no building, organization, or institution be renamed after her. She wanted no Lisa Gates Library, no Lisa Jameson Veteran Center, no statues beyond the first. Instead, she asked that every year, on October 18th, the anniversary of the night she met Bill Gates, people perform what she called a stillness act. No hashtags. No posts. Just 1 hour. Sit beside someone. No phones. No agendas. No fixing. Just be with them. Listen. See. She called it the hour that builds bridges. After her passing, the world mourned quietly. Leaders from around the globe wrote tributes, but the most powerful memorial came from an elementary school in Kansas, where a group of 3rd graders created a wall of drawings. Each one showed 2 stick figures, side by side, under a rainy sky. And every child had written the same words beneath their picture. "I would sit with you." Because that's what Lisa taught the world, that the simplest human gesture, choosing to be with someone in their moment of invisibility, can echo across generations. And to this day, in cities and villages, in halls of government and small shelters, people still remember her name. But more importantly, they remember what she saw in them. Years passed. Lisa's impact had become woven into the fabric of modern philanthropy and public service, but just as she had once emerged quietly from the shadows, so too did a new figure, one who would carry her spirit forward in an unexpected way. Her name was Amora Collins, a young woman from Detroit. She had grown up in foster care, bounced from shelter to shelter, often reading in library corners where Scene was kept on the inspirational shelf. She remembered reading Lisa's words for the first time at age 12, crouched between two bookshelves during a rainstorm that echoed eerily like Lisa's first night with Bill Gates. In Lisa, Amora didn't just see hope, she saw a map. Amora had no military background. No powerful connections. No fame. But she had a gift, an uncanny ability to listen with such depth that people felt transformed just being near her. By the time she was 25, she had volunteered with 6 outreach programs and founded a small initiative called Echo Warm, a nighttime response unit that delivered both physical aid and emotional presence to at-risk youth. Her idea was simple but radical: pair former recipients of aid with active volunteers, not as charity workers but as peer guides. Instead of intake forms, conversations. Instead of fixing, understanding. Lisa's former foundation, Second Watch, heard of her work through a documentary intern who had once filmed Lisa's speech in D.C. The board invited Amora to a summit in New York. She nearly didn't go, she didn't think she belonged. But something in her pulled forward, that same current Lisa once felt in her bones. During her closing remarks at the summit, Amora stood behind the podium, visibly shaking. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small laminated quote she'd carried since she was a teenager. "Being seen saved my life. Seeing others changed it." She held it up and said, "I didn't come here to be praised. I came because Lisa taught me that legacies don't live in buildings, they live in people. And I think it's time for a new chapter." Silence. Then thunderous applause. Amora was invited to join Second Watch as a regional director, but she proposed something different. "I'd like to partner," she said, "not join. What I'm doing is different, not better, just rooted somewhere else." Lisa built bridges for people who wore uniforms. "I want to build bridges for people who were never given any armor to begin with." The board agreed, unanimously. And thus began a collaboration called Parallel Paths, a bold initiative that brought together two communities long seen separately, veterans and system-impacted youth. Amora's theory was this: both know what it means to be invisible after service. Both know what it means to be told you're not needed anymore. But what if they heal together? In one powerful example, a program in Philadelphia paired retired combat medics with teen survivors of domestic abuse, where the medics taught first aid and the teens taught digital storytelling. Mutual empowerment. Mutual trust. Amora often said, "I don't want to be the next Lisa. I want to be the first Amora, and the bridge between stories." Her programs expanded rapidly. By her early 30s, she had spoken before the UN, collaborated with NGOs in Brazil and Kenya, and even returned to Detroit to open the Listening Place, a center where no services were offered during the first visit, only a chair, a warm drink, and someone to listen without judgment. One day, she received a package. It had no return address. Inside, wrapped in soft navy cloth, was the original notebook Lisa had carried during the creation of the Scene Library. Its cover was worn, the spine cracked, but inside, Amora found something extraordinary: handwritten notes, letters from those first veterans, and at the very back, a blank page, with only 3 words. "Now it's yours." Tears welled in Amora's eyes. She placed the notebook on a shelf in the Listening Place, behind glass, with a small sign. "Do not idolize. Do not archive. Let it live." And so it did. The legacy of Lisa, now passed through Amora, continued to breathe, not through the fame of faces, but in the warmth of unseen moments. Years later, another child would crouch between 2 library shelves during a storm, open a worn copy of Scene, and trace a finger down the page, not knowing the whole world was about to shift for them, too. Because some legacies are not stories we tell. They are stories we join. As Amora's influence grew, so did the delicate balance between visibility and vulnerability. She had always believed in transparency, not in the performative sense, but in the sacred, shared way that allowed others to feel less alone. And yet, the more she was asked to speak on stages, to headline conferences, to pose for magazines, the more she began to sense a dangerous distortion. She wasn't becoming a symbol. She was becoming a brand. One quiet evening in Oakland, Amora sat alone in the courtyard behind the listening place, watching dusk settle between the buildings. The city buzzed just beyond the fence, but inside that courtyard, there was only stillness. She opened Lisa's old notebook again, the one she kept behind glass but took out when no one was around. There was a passage she kept returning to, scrawled in Lisa's familiar, slanted handwriting. Don't let the world carve you into a statue while your heart's still beating. Amora closed the notebook, let out a long breath, and made a decision. The next day, she declined 3 major speaking events and wrote a public letter titled The Sound of Stepping Back. In it, she thanked those who had elevated her voice, but made it clear that she needed to return to the roots of why she had started. You don't need to hear me. You need to hear each other. The letter went viral, of course. People called her courageous. Some accused her of privilege, others of abandoning responsibility. But Amora didn't reply. Instead, she turned all her attention to a quiet experiment. Echo houses. These weren't shelters. They weren't clinics. They were neighborhood homes converted into radically simple sanctuaries, no intake forms, no judgment, just a place where people could sleep, eat, and talk to someone who had once been exactly where they were. She trained guides, not staff. There were no uniforms. The rule was, no one asks what happened to you, until someone says, I want to tell you. Within 2 years, there were echo houses in 12 cities. Within 4, there were 48. And in every single one of them, on the wall near the entrance, there was a photo, not of Amora, not of Lisa, but of 2 people sitting side by side in the rain. No caption. Just the image. The unspoken origin of it all. But history, even kind history, has its turns. One day, an investigative article came out in a major national magazine, suggesting that echo houses, while beautifully intentioned, were inefficient, unsupervised, and unaccountable to traditional funding structures. The criticism was not new. But this time, the backlash was coordinated. Large institutions began pulling support. Grants were revoked. Critics called it compassion without competency. Amora was summoned to testify before a federal oversight committee. When asked, "Do you regret creating echo houses without stricter oversight?" she paused, leaned into the microphone, and said, "I regret that our systems only trust people when they're on a spreadsheet." Silence. Then murmurs. Then a shift. A week later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. From an elderly woman in Minnesota. A former veteran. Once homeless. She wrote, "I lived in one of your houses. I never said a word. I just slept for 3 days and left. But I needed that sleep more than I needed a lecture. That place saved me. Thank you." That letter was read into the congressional record. And with it, the tide began to turn. Foundations that had once withdrawn support returned, but this time with fewer strings. Universities began partnering to study the echo effect, the healing power of being witnessed without being diagnosed. And most importantly, the public, the people, reclaimed the story. Years later, at the dedication of the 100th Echo House, Amora didn't speak. She stood among the crowd, unnoticed by most, watching as a former foster child cut the ribbon with a veteran who had once slept under a bridge. They hugged, laughed, cried. Afterward, the young woman approached Amora and said, "Are you the lady who started all this?" Amora smiled and replied, "No. I just listened to the woman who did." And so it went. Ripples became waves. Waves became tides. Tides became oceans. When Amora passed away decades later, there were no statues, no monuments, no street names. But there were thousands of echo houses. Millions of stories. And billions of small, quiet moments, the kind that never make the news, but make a life. And in one final tribute, at the listening place, a small plaque was added beneath Lisa's photo. It read, "Lisa saw her. Amora heard her. The rest of us followed the echo." Years passed. The world changed, as it always does. Wars came and went. Economies rose and fell. But one thing remained quietly constant: the spread of the eco philosophy. What had begun as one rainy conversation in Seattle had grown into a global network of what were now called eco sanctuaries, homes, community centers, reading rooms, listening circles, even converted buses in rural villages. In more than 40 countries, these spaces all shared a single rule: no one is invisible here. But with the passing of Amora Collins, something else stirred. In a small town in South Africa, near the edge of the Karoo Desert, a boy named Themba stumbled across a copy of Seen in a dusty second-hand shop. The book had no cover, just the weathered title scrawled across the first page in ink that had begun to fade. Themba was 12 years old, recently orphaned, and living in the back room of his uncle's auto repair garage. He had no real reason to pick up the book, but he did. That night, reading by a flickering lantern, he found a passage about Lisa sitting in silence with a woman who had lost everything. He read about Amora, turning her back on applause to build something real. And by the time the lantern burned out, something inside him had shifted. Themba didn't have money. He didn't have influence. But what he had was clarity, the kind that visits only those who have nothing to lose and everything to imagine. By 17, he had created a gathering space behind the garage, a few chairs, a broken refrigerator filled with water bottles, and a blackboard with a single word written across it: Seen. Kids from the neighborhood came first. Then elders. Then a wandering journalist, who wrote a piece called The Boy Who Built a Door When the World Gave Him None. That article made its way to an old archivist at the Gates Foundation in Seattle. And from there, like a whispered secret, the story reached thousands. But this time, no foundation swooped in. No governments tried to scale the idea. Instead, people from around the world began sending Themba small packages, used notebooks, second-hand books, tiny donations, letters of encouragement. They didn't try to shape his work. They simply supported it. Themba called his project Dustlight, a place where even the smallest spark could catch. Over the next 10 years, Dustlight centers popped up in Kenya, India, Brazil, and Hungary, wherever people needed warmth without walls. But unlike eco houses, these were not centralized. There was no headquarters. No brand identity. Each one was autonomous, led by locals, held together by a single tenet. Sit. Listen. Let them speak first. One day, Themba received a visitor, a quiet woman in her 50s who introduced herself only as Marin. She said she had once lived in a halfway house in Philadelphia, one of the original eco locations. Amora herself had helped her fill out an application for nursing school. I just wanted to see what happens when a story grows legs, she said. They talked long into the night. And when she left, she gave Themba a small cloth-wrap package. Inside was Lisa's original notebook. Passed from Lisa to Amora. From Amora to the archives. And from there to him. At the back was now another page, newly written in Amora's clean, deliberate script. I've said what I needed to say. You write the rest. Themba didn't feel ready. But he knew no one ever did. And so, he began to write, not memoirs, not manifestos. Just fragments of voices he'd heard. A young girl describing the way her brother used to sing before the war. A grandfather remembering the taste of his mother's stew. A teenager recounting the first time someone told him he mattered. Page after page after page. Eventually, the notebook was digitized, its entries translated into 90 languages. It became known as the Book of Us, a living archive of human voices, anonymous, unscripted, real. Schools taught from it. Prisons held reading circles with it. Refugee camps played audio versions of its stories each night before sleep. And the final echo? It hasn't come yet. Because in one distant village, on one quiet night, a child will pick up a torn book or hear a whispered story. They'll read about Lisa, about Amora, about Themba. And something will light up inside them, the smallest flicker of being seen. And then, quietly, they will begin. Years passed, and the world around Dustlight began to change in unexpected ways. Though it remained small in scale compared to other global initiatives, the impact it had was deep and wide, rippling through communities and individuals in ways no one could have predicted. The simplicity of its message, sit, listen, let them speak first, became a quiet revolution in a world increasingly driven by noise, division, and distraction. As the years went on, new leaders emerged within Dustlight's network. These weren't people with titles or resumes full of impressive accomplishments. They were everyday people who had, like Themba, found themselves changed by the power of simply being heard. Each new center that sprang up was born from a personal moment, a moment when someone realized they had the capacity to listen, to create a space for others to be seen. In the town of Girona, Spain, a woman named Rosa opened a Dustlight center in her garage. She had once been a social worker, but after a personal tragedy, she had left her job. Struggling with grief and finding herself disconnected from her community, she stumbled upon one of Themba's letters about Dustlight and decided to create a space for others like her, people who had lost their way but still had something to give. Rosa transformed her small, cold garage into a welcoming space, pillows on the floor, walls lined with donated books, a table where anyone who entered could share whatever was on their mind. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't a support group. It was simply a place to talk without judgment, a place where people could sit and tell their story without the pressure to fix anything. In the first few months, Rosa was unsure of the impact. Some days, only 1 or 2 people would come by. On others, a steady stream of strangers would walk in, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories. She learned that some needed to speak, while others simply needed silence. One afternoon, a man named Enrique walked in. He was older, in his 60s, and had a heavy limp from a work accident years ago. He was a retired carpenter, his hands gnarled and rough. He had been a loner for most of his life, never married, no children. For years, he had carried a quiet bitterness inside him, a resentment that had only grown after his accident left him unable to work. Rosa didn't ask him what he needed or what had brought him to Dustlight. Instead, she offered him tea and asked him simply to sit with her. They said nothing for a while. It was only after an hour of quiet companionship that Enrique began to speak. "I used to be someone," he said quietly. "But I lost everything. My job, my pride, my self-worth. I didn't know where to turn. But this place, it feels different." Rosa listened. She didn't rush him. She didn't offer advice or try to solve his pain. She just let him talk. It was that day that Enrique returned to Dustlight, not to talk, but to listen. He became a regular, sitting in silence with those who came after him. Over time, his bitterness faded, and in its place, something new blossomed, not hope, but peace. Peace that he wasn't alone. Peace that there were people who had also lost something, people who understood. As the Dustlight network grew, these stories multiplied. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in a remote village in Peru, high in the Andes. The village, once isolated by geography, had been struggling with poverty, illness, and a lack of education for generations. But when a young woman named Lucia returned from the city with a copy of the Book of Us, the village was forever changed. Lucia had left her small village years earlier, determined to get an education. She was the first in her family to do so. But when she returned, she was troubled. The village was still struggling. There was no clean water. Children were still working in the fields instead of going to school. The elderly had little to no access to health care. The community was fractured, with people working in isolation rather than coming together. But Lucia had learned something that the village hadn't yet realized: the power of community. She had read the Book of Us and realized that the first step to solving their problems wasn't more infrastructure or more aid. It was coming together and listening to one another. She began organizing regular meetings in the town square, asking everyone, from the youngest children to the oldest grandparents, to sit and share their stories. The first few meetings were awkward. People didn't know what to say. They were used to working alone, struggling in silence. But slowly, as Lucia encouraged them, people began to open up. They shared stories of hardship, of dreams, of the things that mattered to them. They began to understand each other in ways they never had before. As the weeks went by, the change was subtle but profound. The village began to collaborate. The children went to school, and the elders taught the younger generation traditional crafts and farming techniques. Together, they built a well. Together, they created a cooperative where they could sell their goods and support one another. The walls of isolation began to crumble, replaced by a deep sense of shared purpose. It wasn't long before other villages in the region took notice. Lucia was invited to share her experiences with neighboring towns, and soon Dustlight centers were opening all over the Andes, in places once considered too remote for any real change. Lucia's work was quietly revolutionary, and it was based on something simple: sitting together, hearing each other, and respecting the stories of those around them. Years passed, and the legacy of Dustlight continued to grow, not in grand gestures, but in small, quiet acts of humanity. Across the world, the story of Lisa, Amora, Themba, and Lucia became a part of the collective consciousness. Schools taught the importance of listening. Media outlets showcased the power of simple human connection. Political leaders, once eager to impose solutions, began to take a step back and listen to the voices of the people they had long ignored. In the end, it wasn't the technology or the grand initiatives that made the difference. It wasn't the billion-dollar foundations or the major news stories. What truly changed the world was the act of being seen, of listening, of understanding. And as for Themba, he continued to lead Dustlight with quiet humility. When people asked him how he had built something so profound from nothing, he would simply smile and say, "I didn't build it. We did. I just made space for it to grow." In the end, Dustlight wasn't just a movement. It was a reflection of what could happen when people came together, not to fix each other, but to honor each other's humanity. As the years rolled on, Dustlight became more than just a network of community spaces. It evolved into a global testament to the power of human connection. The idea that every individual had a story worth hearing spread like wildfire, not just in communities but across nations. It became a guiding philosophy for a generation of activists, educators, and everyday people who sought to change the world not by fighting against its flaws but by listening to and understanding its complexities. In cities, rural areas, and even war-torn regions, the principles of Dustlight continued to resonate. There were countless stories of people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the simple act of being seen, of being truly heard, without judgment or expectation. From young children who once felt invisible in their overcrowded classrooms to elderly refugees who thought their voices had been forgotten, Dustlight created a space where everyone's experience was honored. Perhaps the most unexpected impact was seen in the business world. Companies, often criticized for their impersonal nature, began to incorporate the principles of Dustlight into their work cultures. They shifted from a focus on efficiency and productivity to a recognition that the heart of every successful enterprise was its people. Companies that once prioritized profits above all else began to understand that the well-being of their employees, their emotional and mental health, their sense of purpose, was integral to their success. One tech giant, whose offices were once cold and sterile, became a case study in workplace transformation. They opened listening rooms, inspired by Dustlight, where employees could meet with trained counselors or simply sit in silence, reflecting on their thoughts. Over time, these spaces became the most popular areas in the office. Productivity soared, but it wasn't due to increased pressure. It was because employees, finally feeling seen and heard, were empowered to do their best work. In the arts, Dustlight influenced a new wave of storytelling that focused on authenticity over sensationalism. Filmmakers, authors, and musicians began creating works that reflected the untold stories of everyday people, stories not of grand victories or epic struggles, but of quiet moments of connection, of people meeting each other where they were and truly listening. These stories, once overlooked, found massive audiences who resonated deeply with their truth. In academia, universities began offering courses on the philosophy of listening. Professors taught students the art of empathy, not just as a soft skill but as a fundamental building block of communication. They studied the impact of being seen on mental health, social cohesion, and community resilience. What started as a movement to combat isolation had evolved into an academic field of its own, influencing disciplines ranging from sociology to psychology. At the heart of it all was the quiet figure who had first introduced the world to the idea of sitting with others in silence. Themba, now in his late 40s, had become a kind of global elder. He continued to travel, not as a figurehead, but as a humble servant of the message that had shaped his life. He visited Dustlight centers across the world, offering guidance not through speeches or lectures but through his presence. He sat with people. He listened. In a remote village in the Philippines, a young man named Raphael, inspired by the principles of Dustlight, started a center in the abandoned room of his grandmother's house. The community there had long been divided by generational gaps, with the elders unwilling to speak to the younger generation and the youth feeling unheard. Raphael's vision was simple: create a space where people of all ages could come together, share their experiences, and listen to one another. It didn't matter if the conversations were uncomfortable or awkward. What mattered was that the silence between them was broken. Over the years, Raphael's center became a central hub of change in the village. It wasn't a place for grand speeches or political debates, but a place where the community began to heal, where the older generations shared their wisdom, and the younger ones found their voice. The village, once fraught with tension, grew into a thriving community of mutual respect. Meanwhile, in New York City, a group of teenagers from vastly different backgrounds began to meet at a Dustlight center in the heart of the Bronx. They came from various neighborhoods, each with its own history of tension and division. At first, they were hesitant to speak, unsure of how to relate to each other. But over time, they began to share their stories of growing up in poverty, of violence in their neighborhoods, of dreams that felt unattainable. Through listening, they found common ground. They discovered that despite their differences, they were not so different after all. They became a powerful force for positive change in their own community, organizing outreach programs for younger children, advocating for better school resources, and even partnering with local businesses to provide job training for their peers. One evening, as they gathered for their weekly meeting, a boy named Malik stood up. He had been quiet at first, unsure of his place in the group. But now, he looked around at the faces of his friends, his fellow listeners, and spoke. "I never thought I'd find peace in this neighborhood," Malik said. "But here, with all of you, I feel seen. And that's everything." The others nodded, some of them with tears in their eyes. They had done more than just build a space to listen. They had built a community that recognized each other's humanity and was willing to fight for it. Back in Seattle, a small memorial was erected in honor of the origin of Dustlight, the spot where Lisa, Amora, and Themba had first shared their stories with the world. It was a simple stone bench, set beneath the shade of an old tree. Inscribed on the plaque was the phrase, "Every life has value. Every moment matters. Every person deserves to be seen." It wasn't much, just a bench and some words. But to those who had been a part of Dustlight's journey, it was everything. It was a reminder that the power to change the world wasn't in grand gestures, but in small, everyday acts of seeing and being seen. And so, the ripple continued to spread, generation by generation, community by community, until it reached places where people never imagined it could, from forgotten corners of the earth to the hearts of the powerful. It became clear the Dustlight movement would never truly end. It wasn't a passing trend or a fleeting moment of compassion. It was a new way of living, of connecting, of being with one another. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world would one day realize that the most revolutionary act of all wasn't building a new technology or developing a new theory. It was the quiet act of listening, of truly seeing another person. Because when that happens, the world is never the same again. And as long as there were people willing to listen, Dustlight would continue to grow, like a fire that, once sparked, could never be extinguished. As the years passed, Dustlight's impact became undeniable, woven into the fabric of communities and even shaping national conversations. The movement had sparked a quiet revolution, one that couldn't be measured by numbers or financial success, but by the profound changes it made in how people related to one another. Across the world, from urban centers to remote rural areas, there were those who carried the Dustlight ethos in their hearts and actions. In Australia, a group of former miners in a small town started a local initiative called Silent Stories. Every month, they would meet in the town hall, which had long been empty since the mine shut down. The tradition was simple: anyone who attended could share a personal story, but only after they listened to someone else's first. The stories were as diverse as the people who shared them: tales of hardship, triumph, dreams deferred, and dreams realized. The result was transformative. It turned a community that had been fractured by economic collapse into one that rallied around each other, finding strength in their shared humanity. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, a school for troubled youth in Sweden implemented Dustlight's principles into its curriculum. Teachers there didn't just teach subjects, they taught how to be good listeners. They encouraged students to form peer circles where they could talk about their struggles, their fears, and their hopes. These circles were not about judgment, but about seeing each other fully. Students who had once felt unseen, dismissed by society for their behavior or backgrounds, found in these circles a space where they could breathe, express, and heal. Over time, truancy rates dropped, and graduation rates soared, as these young people began to find their voices not just in their classrooms, but in their futures. In the Middle East, Dustlight inspired a group of women in Lebanon who, despite the region's complexities and ongoing challenges, formed a support network for widows and mothers who had lost everything to conflict. Many of these women had been left behind by a society that had long overlooked them, but they were determined to rebuild not just their lives, but the lives of their children. The group, known as Voices of Hope, met every week to share their stories and strategies for survival. They listened to each other's pain, offered support, and slowly began advocating for systemic change. They met with lawmakers, demanding better healthcare, education, and support for women affected by war. Their strength came from understanding each other's struggles, offering solace, and uniting for a common cause to ensure no one would ever feel as though they had been forgotten. Back in the United States, the concept of listening circles continued to flourish. Universities began to incorporate them into their campuses, not just in counseling departments but in student organizations, sports teams, and even business courses. Listening circles became an essential part of leadership training, as future leaders learned that to guide others effectively, they must first understand them deeply. These circles weren't just about the exchange of words, they were about the silent, often unnoticed power of truly hearing someone. It became a foundational practice in conflict resolution, team building, and even politics. One particularly inspiring case was the transformation of a correctional facility in Texas. The prison had long been a place of violence and despair. But when the warden, a former social worker, began incorporating the Dustlight philosophy into the prison's rehabilitation program, things started to change. Inmates who had once been violent and withdrawn began to open up in group therapy sessions, sharing their life stories with one another. The listening circles didn't erase the crimes they had committed, but they gave the prisoners the opportunity to address their own pain, understand each other's motives, and rebuild their sense of humanity. Over the next few years, the recidivism rate among those who participated in the program dropped drastically. The facility became a model for restorative justice, showing that even in the darkest places, healing could begin when people were willing to listen, truly listen. But it wasn't just the community that saw change. The Dustlight Foundation, which had initially been created to honor Lisa's legacy, grew into an international organization with branches in over 50 countries. The foundation was no longer just about providing physical shelter for homeless veterans, though that was still an integral part of their work. It had expanded its scope to address the mental and emotional health of marginalized individuals, veterans, refugees, the elderly, at-risk youth, and the homeless. Their programs were holistic, combining shelter, job training, healthcare, and, most importantly, mental health support. The cornerstone of the foundation's approach was the belief that if a person didn't feel heard, if they didn't feel valued, no amount of material support could heal them. Bill Gates, who had become a quiet ally in Lisa's work, was often asked about the global reach of Dustlight. He never claimed it as his own initiative, but he was undeniably proud of what it had become. In one of his rare public statements about the movement, he said, "Technology can solve many problems, but it's empathy and understanding that will solve the hardest ones. The greatest gift you can give someone is the gift of presence, the gift of seeing them. Everything else follows from that." Even as Lisa grew older, she remained deeply involved with the foundation. She no longer traveled as frequently, but her work continued to shape the direction of the movement. She would often reflect on the years that had passed since that rainy evening when Bill had first stopped to sit with her. Back then, she had been just another face in the crowd, another name lost in the noise. But today, she was one of the most recognized humanitarians in the world, a symbol of resilience and compassion. Yet, she always remained grounded, constantly reminding herself and others that the heart of the movement was not in grand gestures or media coverage but in the quiet act of listening. As she sat on the porch of her small cottage by the sea, a place where she had found peace in her later years, Lisa thought about the countless people she had met throughout her journey. She thought about the veterans, the refugees, the homeless, and the children. Each one had a story, a unique experience of struggle and survival. And every time someone shared their story with her, she felt the weight of the world lift just a little bit. Listening was a form of love, she had come to believe. It was a silent act of kindness that allowed someone else to feel seen, to feel important. Her memoir, Seen, continued to inspire new generations, and it had become a cornerstone text in universities around the world. The book didn't just recount her own life, it was a celebration of all the people who had crossed her path, all the voices she had listened to, and all the lives that had been transformed by the simple act of being heard. And in the end, Lisa's legacy wasn't in the buildings that bore her name or the awards that adorned her walls. It was in the countless listening circles, the quiet moments of connection, and the movement that continued to grow long after she was gone. In the world she had helped shape, every voice had a place. Every person had a seat at the table. And in every corner of the earth, the message of Dustlight lived on, a reminder that the most profound change begins not with what we do, but with who we choose to see. As Lisa's legacy continued to grow, it transcended geographical boundaries and cultures, becoming a beacon of hope in a world often too consumed by its own noise to truly hear one another. Her influence had been quiet. Never the type to seek the spotlight, but her actions spoke louder than any speech could. And even as her influence spread across continents, she never forgot the very first step of her journey, that cold, rainy night in Seattle, where she had been seen not as a problem to be fixed, but as a person with her own story and worth. One particularly poignant moment came years later when Lisa was invited to speak at a global summit on homelessness and mental health in Paris. As she took the stage, her hand shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of what had come before her, the people she had met, the lives she had touched. The room, filled with leaders from various fields, sat in rapt attention as she shared her story, not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a reminder of the power of human connection. "I am here," she began, her voice steady yet filled with an emotion that resonated with every person in the room, "because one man, one single act of kindness, changed the course of my life. It wasn't just Bill Gates' wealth or influence that helped me. It was his willingness to sit with me, to listen. That simple act of seeing me, in my lowest moment, set me on a path I never could have imagined. And it's that act of seeing that we must all carry forward." She spoke of the countless people she had encountered, the veterans, the displaced persons, the marginalized, and how each one had shared their own story, their own pain, their own dreams. Each one had been a reminder that behind every statistic, every label, every headline, there was a life. A person. When the speech ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Leaders from governments, NGOs, and corporations lined up to speak with her afterward, asking how they could implement the Dustlight principles in their own work. For many, the summit had been a turning point. The idea that empathy and listening could be as transformative as any policy or monetary donation resonated deeply with them. The Dustlight movement was no longer just a foundation, it had become a global paradigm shift. But even as the movement flourished, Lisa remained humble, always attributing the success of the initiative to the people she had met along the way, and the ones who had continued to show up and listen. "We are all simply vessels for something larger than ourselves," she would say in interviews, always deflecting praise. The final chapter of Lisa's story came quietly, without fanfare. After years of giving speeches, mentoring the next generation of leaders, and overseeing the Dustlight Foundation's worldwide expansion, she began to withdraw from the public eye. She was not sick, nor tired of the work, rather, she felt that her time in the spotlight had come to a close. In her final years, Lisa returned to the peaceful coastal town in Oregon where she had once sought refuge, and there she quietly continued her work, but on a much smaller, more intimate scale. In those last years, she worked with local communities, helping to train facilitators for the listening circles she had once introduced on a global stage. She would spend her days sitting with young people, veterans, and those on the fringes of society, reminding them that their voices mattered, that they too had something valuable to offer. Her home, now filled with handwritten letters from around the world, served as a haven for those seeking guidance, wisdom, or just someone to talk to. When Lisa passed away peacefully in her sleep, the world mourned, but it wasn't a mourning of loss, but rather a celebration of a life that had touched so many. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, from world leaders to those she had helped personally. A memorial was held in the small coastal town where she had spent her final years, and thousands of people, many of them individuals she had never met, attended. They weren't there for the spotlight, they were there because Lisa had seen them. She had seen their struggles, their pain, their worth. In her memory, a statue was erected in the town square. It was a simple design, just Lisa sitting on a bench, her hand outstretched, as if inviting someone to join her. Beneath the statue were the words she had lived by. A reminder of the philosophy that had shaped her life: every person deserves to be seen. The Dustlight Foundation, now led by a team of dedicated individuals, continued to thrive. It became an institution of compassion, driven by the principles Lisa had instilled in it. The foundation expanded its reach to tackle not just homelessness, but systemic inequalities, mental health issues, and education. It became a global network for empathy and change, one where individuals could find not just support, but a community that truly understood them. And still, in every corner of the world, the message of Dustlight continued to echo: the most important work any of us can do is to truly see one another. For when we see someone, when we listen to their story and acknowledge their humanity, we create a world where no one has to suffer in silence. Though Lisa was no longer physically present, her spirit lived on in every listening circle, in every outreach program, in every conversation that began with the words, "Tell me your story." And that was enough. She had changed the world, not through grand gestures or a monumental breakthrough, but by seeing the people no one else cared to see. And in doing so, she had shown the world the power of empathy, the power of listening, and the power of simply being present with another person. That was the true legacy she left behind. And so, the story of Lisa, the woman who had once been homeless and forgotten, became a story of global impact, one that inspired millions, not because she had achieved greatness, but because she had reminded us all of our shared humanity. Her life, and the lives she touched, became an eternal testament to the simple, yet profound, truth that sometimes, all it takes to change the world is to sit down beside someone and truly listen. As the years passed, the impact of Lisa's legacy only deepened. Her work, initially born from a chance encounter on a rainy Seattle street corner, became woven into the fabric of how society viewed homelessness, mental health, and the invisible struggles that many faced. The Dustlight Foundation expanded its mission beyond what Lisa had ever dreamed possible. It wasn't just an organization, it was a movement, one that brought light to the darkest corners of society. In the quiet town in Oregon where she had chosen to live out her final years, Lisa's memory continued to shape the lives of those who had been touched by her. Local schools incorporated lessons from her life into their curricula, teaching students the value of empathy, resilience, and seeing others. Her memoir, Seen, became required reading in many universities across the world, an essential text for those studying social work, psychology, and even leadership. But it wasn't just the young minds being shaped by Lisa's message. Even well into her retirement, Lisa still received letters from people whose lives she had changed. They weren't letters from the wealthy or powerful, they were from ordinary people who had found themselves in dark moments, feeling invisible, feeling lost. Some of them were veterans, others were survivors of abuse, or people who had found themselves homeless due to circumstances beyond their control. But all of them shared one thing in common: they had been seen. And for that, they were forever grateful. Even in death, Lisa remained a symbol of possibility. When people spoke of her, they didn't just speak of the woman who had once been homeless, they spoke of the woman who had shown the world how to be truly present for one another. Her name became synonymous with compassion and strength. She was celebrated not just for the programs she built, but for the relationships she nurtured and the lives she transformed. One of the most powerful moments came when a young woman named Rachel, who had once been a client of the Dustlight Foundation, stepped forward to share her own story. She had grown up in foster care and, after aging out of the system, found herself homeless, struggling to survive. She had been at the lowest point of her life when she walked into the doors of a Dustlight outreach center. "I was broken," Rachel began, standing before an audience at a Dustlight-sponsored conference. "I had no idea where to go or who to turn to. I didn't even know if I was worthy of help. But then, I met someone who looked me in the eye and didn't see a problem, a statistic, or a burden. She saw me. She listened to my story, and she gave me hope." Rachel went on to explain how Lisa had been the first person who truly believed in her, who gave her the space to heal and rebuild. With the help of the Dustlight Foundation, Rachel was able to get an education, find stable housing, and eventually start her own advocacy work. She became a powerful voice for those still struggling, using her platform to share the same compassion that Lisa had shown her. "Lisa gave me my life back," Rachel said, tears welling in her eyes. "And I promise to carry that torch for the rest of my life." The room erupted in applause, and in that moment, the full impact of Lisa's work came into sharp focus. It wasn't just about getting people off the streets. It was about changing the very way society viewed those who had been cast aside. It was about creating a ripple effect that would continue for generations. The Dustlight Foundation's global outreach program had helped hundreds of thousands, but it was the individual stories, like Rachel's, that really encapsulated the spirit of the movement. Each person who walked through the doors of Dustlight was seen not just as someone in need, but as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. And as more stories like Rachel's emerged, the world began to shift. As the years went by, the Dustlight Foundation expanded even further. Its model was adopted by other organizations, governments, and institutions worldwide. Cities began to implement listening circles, peer support networks, and outreach initiatives based on Lisa's principles. Homelessness, once viewed as an unsolvable issue, began to be addressed with the same empathy and care that Lisa had championed. It became clear that the real solution was not just providing resources but offering a compassionate, human-centered approach that focused on listening, understanding, and meeting people where they were. In her final years, Lisa became somewhat of a quiet legend. She never sought the recognition, but it came to her nonetheless. Governments awarded her for her humanitarian efforts, and she received countless honors. But even as she received recognition from around the world, she always insisted that the true credit belonged to the thousands of volunteers, donors, and supporters who had helped build Dustlight into the global force it had become. "I am nothing without the people who believed in the work," she would say. The true power lies not in one person, but in all of us choosing to see each other. As Lisa's health began to decline, she spent more time at home in her cozy coastal cottage. She was surrounded by letters, photographs, and mementos from the many people she had touched over the years. The walls were lined with pictures of veterans, children, volunteers, and families, each one a reminder of the lives that had been changed because someone chose to listen. In her final days, a small gathering of close friends and family came together to say goodbye. As Lisa lay peacefully in her bed, one of her last requests was simple: she wanted a quiet funeral, without the grandiose ceremonies. She wanted it to be a celebration of life, a life filled with purpose, love, and connection. The day of her passing, the world mourned not only the loss of a remarkable woman but the loss of a guiding light for countless others. At her memorial service, which was held at the Dustlight Foundation headquarters, there were no speeches from celebrities or political figures. Instead, people who had been impacted by her work stood up one by one to share their stories. These were the people who had been seen. And in their stories, the legacy of Lisa's life continued to live on. And so, the ripple effect continued. The statue in Oregon, the one that depicted Lisa sitting on a bench, hand extended to anyone who would listen, became a symbol of hope. Tourists, activists, and everyday people would stop there, often leaving flowers or notes of thanks. And as they did, they would remember, every person has a story. Every person deserves to be seen. The Dustlight Foundation continues to grow, continuing the work Lisa started, and the world is a little bit kinder, a little bit more empathetic, because of her. Her legacy lives on in every person who chooses to see, to listen, and to make a difference. In the end, Lisa's story was never just about one woman's rise from the streets to global recognition. It was about how one small, simple act of kindness, the willingness to see another human being, can set in motion a tidal wave of change that ripples across the world. It was a story of hope, of redemption, and of the undeniable power of being seen. Lisa had once been invisible to the world. But in the end, she became its greatest light. Her work wasn't just a fleeting moment in time but a lasting legacy that shaped the future. The world, in its own way, had changed. And it all started with one moment, a chance meeting on a rainy Seattle sidewalk. Her story had been passed down through generations, from the old to the young, from mentor to mentee. People who had never met her felt a connection to her, like she was part of their journey, part of their fight for dignity and respect. Her influence stretched far beyond the homeless shelters, the policy halls, and the rooms filled with philanthropists. It spread into classrooms, boardrooms, and even families' living rooms, where children were taught to value empathy and recognize the unseen in their communities. One rainy afternoon, many years after Lisa's passing, a group of young volunteers from the Dustlight Foundation gathered at the headquarters. They were preparing for a new outreach initiative aimed at veterans suffering from PTSD. As they walked through the corridors, they stopped at the gallery that had been built in Lisa's honor. The walls were adorned with photos of people from all walks of life, veterans, students, former clients, and volunteers, all of whom had been impacted by Lisa's message of seeing and truly listening. As they looked at the photographs, one of the volunteers, a young woman named Sophie, spoke up. "I never got to meet her," Sophie said, her voice soft but resolute. "But I've been working here for a while now. And every day, I feel like I know her. Every time I help someone, I feel like I'm carrying on what she started." Her words weren't just a reflection of what she had learned, it was the ripple effect in action. Lisa had never aimed for fame or recognition. But now, generations later, her name was synonymous with social justice and kindness. Lisa's voice wasn't just an echo from the past, it was a call to action for those who had been inspired by her to keep going, to keep pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Sophie's comment prompted others in the room to share their own stories. Stories of the people they had helped, the moments that had made them feel like they were truly making a difference. They spoke of veterans who had found peace through therapy, of women who had started new lives after escaping abuse, and of children whose parents had found the strength to rebuild their lives after spending years on the streets. Each story, no matter how small it seemed, carried the spirit of Lisa forward. As the group continued their work, Sophie realized something profound. The mission that Lisa had started had evolved. It had become a community, a movement, not just a foundation. It was no longer just about offering aid, it was about empowering individuals to become agents of change themselves. Lisa had shown that when people were seen, their potential wasn't just recognized, it was celebrated. In every corner of the world, from bustling cities to small rural towns, people who had once felt invisible now felt a sense of belonging. And as each of them found their own path, they too became part of Lisa's legacy. They helped others, offered a hand to someone who was struggling, and, most importantly, chose to see the humanity in every person they met. It wasn't just about offering a helping hand anymore. It was about creating a world where every person's dignity was respected, where every individual felt valued. And where compassion wasn't seen as a luxury, but as a basic human right. As Dustlight grew, it became a living testament to Lisa's belief that one person, one act of kindness, could spark a chain reaction of change. The foundation expanded its reach beyond veterans to support refugees, the disabled, and those affected by mental health challenges. In some countries, the model that Lisa had created was adapted and replicated, tailored to the unique needs of each community but always with the core principles of seeing and listening intact. Even in the midst of all this success, Lisa's approach had remained simple. When people asked how she had managed to achieve so much, she would often smile and say, "I just tried to be present. I didn't have all the answers. But I was there." Those words would become a guiding mantra for the countless people who had been touched by her work. Because being present, truly present for someone, had the power to heal wounds, offer hope, and change lives. As time went on, the statue of Lisa in Seattle became a pilgrimage site of sorts. People came from all over the world, not just to admire her or remember her, but to take part in the movement she had started. It wasn't about the statue, it was about the moment it represented. The moment when a stranger sat beside someone who was invisible and chose to see them for who they truly were. The story of Bill Gates and Lisa became one of the most cherished tales of philanthropy and humanity. But what often went unsaid was that it wasn't just the money, the resources, or the high-profile connections that had changed Lisa's life, it was the simple act of being seen. Bill Gates had offered something rarer than just financial support. He had offered recognition, the most important thing anyone could give. The story of Lisa, and her quiet but unyielding fight to give others the same recognition, lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had been inspired by her. And the movement she had started, based on one human being seeing another, continued to change the world, ripple by ripple, person by person. For Lisa, that was the ultimate victory. Not just to be remembered, but to have inspired the world to see. And so, even in the final chapters of this story, one thing was clear: Lisa's life had never been defined by where she had started, but by where she helped others go. And for generations to come, her message would remain clear, simple, and powerful. Every person deserves to be seen.